Welcome back to Agribusiness with Dr. G. In this video, we're going to calculate the change in consumer surplus using the formula for the area of a trapezoid. Let's start off by writing down the formula. The change in consumer surplus is equal to negative 1/2 times the height of our trapezoid, which is just the change in the price, P2 minus P1, multiplied by the length of the top of the trapezoid plus the length of the bottom of that trapezoid, which turns out to be just the sum of our two quantities, Q1 plus Q2. So this is our formula. Let's apply it. As always, we're going to draw a market diagram. So here's the vertical axis, which will be labeled with a P for price, and then the horizontal axis, which will be labeled with a Q for the quantity. And since we're talking about the change in the consumer surplus, we need a downward sloping demand curve. We're going to label that with a D for demand. This represents our consumer. Now, demand curves always slope down, and that's very important to remember. They always slope down, which means they have a negative slope. And I want to roll back up to the formula that I just wrote. And in this formula, we have a negative sign at the beginning of our formula. That negative sign is there because the demand curve slopes down. So let's go ahead and get some numbers to plug in. Let's have a starting price P1 of 6, and the quantity that goes with 6 in this example that I'm just making up is... Now we need a second price, P2, because we've got a change in the price. That's what's causing this to happen. The price has changed. So we're going from P1 to P2, where the 1 and the 2 represent timestamps. The 1 is before, the 2 is after. In fact, I'm going to do a gray color for P2 with the hopes it'll kind of stand out a little bit on the screen. So let's say P2 is equal to 3, and at that price, the quantity demanded is 150. And that is Q number 2. And 100 will be Q number 1. Now I'm going to go up to this diagram and I'm going to shade in everything that's in between the two prices all the way out to the demand curve. We're interested in this trapezoid that is bounded by our prices and the demand curve. So the height of that trapezoid is the difference between the prices, and it goes all the way out to the demand curve. Let's plug in our formula. The change in consumer surplus equals negative 1/2 of the change in the price. So that's going to be 3 minus 6. Because P2 is 3, that's the second price. The second price goes first in the formula. So it's going to be P2 minus P1, 3 minus 6. And we're going to multiply that by the sum of our two quantities, Q1 plus Q2, because those are the lengths of the top and the bottom of our trapezoid. Let's plug these numbers in. This is going to be equal to 1/2 of negative 3. And that's going to give us 1/2 multiplied by 750. In other words, 750 divided by 2. Before we go on, I want to show you something. Make sure you see this. We have a negative here and a negative here. You're going to multiply two negatives and you get a positive. Keeping up with our signs are going to be very important. So 1/2 of 750 is equal to 375, and this is in dollars. We measure the change in consumer surplus in dollars. This is basically saying that our consumers are better off by $375 as a result of this change in the price. Let's go back up to the diagram, to the graph, and take a look at what's going on. The price went down from $6 to $3. So the people in this market are able to buy this for less money. That makes them happy. Let me draw a smiley face right here. And that's important to remember. When the price is lower, you're paying less for it, you're better off. The price is lower and the quantity is also higher. So you're buying more and you're paying less per unit. So we should expect the result to be a positive number. Our consumers are better off. And that's what's happened here. The consumer surplus, or rather the change in consumer surplus, is greater than 0, which means that our consumers have received a gain as a result of this price change. That makes our consumers very happy. So we would call this an increase in consumer surplus. This is a net positive for our consumers. Let's look at another example. So let's draw a new diagram. Let's label it appropriately. The price on the vertical axis, the quantity on the horizontal axis, and once again, our downward sloping, our negatively sloped demand curve. We're going to have a starting price of P1. We're going to let P1 be equal to 10. And at that price, the quantity demanded, the amount that our consumers want to buy at that price, is 100. Now we need a new price, P2, so we can have a price change. Let's set P2 equal to 20. And like always, there is a quantity that corresponds to that price. So when the price is 20, the quantity demanded is going to be 10. Sure, let's go with 10. The numbers really aren't that important as long as they're kind of consistent. What we're looking for eventually is this area here that I'm shading in. It's a trapezoid that's in between our two prices and to the left of our demand curve. That's the trapezoid we want, and we're just going to use the formula for the area of a trapezoid. Before we do any math, I want to point out that the price went up. And when the price goes up, our consumer is going to be less happy. So when we're done, we should expect to have a negative result. There'll be a decrease in consumer surplus. Here we see that the quantity has fallen. So we have consumers who are paying more and buying less stuff. That's going to mean less utility for the consumers, less happiness, and as a result, the change in consumer surplus should be negative. That's this area here that I've shaded in delta CS. That Greek uppercase delta is what we're doing there, and that stands for change, and the change in consumer surplus should be negative, so our consumers should be worse off. Let's plug some numbers into the formula, and let me show you how that works. So the change in consumer surplus is equal to negative 1/2 times the price change, P2 minus P1, close the parentheses, open a new one, and multiply by Q2 plus Q1, or Q1 plus 2, because you're adding, it doesn't matter what order they go in. Before we plug in any numbers, I want to point out that this thing right here in the middle, P2 minus P1, is going to be the height of our trapezoid. This distance right here between 20 and 10. And Q2 plus Q1 will be the base 1 plus base 2, or the length of the top plus the length of the bottom. Here is the length of the top, and here is the length of the bottom. So let's add some numbers. Negative 1/2 multiplied by, open parentheses, 20 minus 10, close the parentheses, open a new one, and then the two quantities, 10 plus 100. Close that parentheses. Before we start plugging in the numbers into our calculator, I want to point out that 20 minus 10 is going to be positive, and the negative 1/2 is going to be negative. So we're going to end up multiplying a positive by a negative. Now, of course, 10 plus 100 is going to be positive. And that's important to remember because we're going to end up with a negative number because we're multiplying a negative times a positive. So this becomes negative 1/2 times 10. Multiply that by 110. This becomes negative 5 times 110, which is just negative 550. So that tells us that our change in consumer surplus is going to be less than 0 because it's a negative number. This means that our consumers are worse off. The consumer surplus went down. So our consumers are not happy about this. They are measurably worse off. So let's draw a frowny face. And there we go. That's 2 examples of how to calculate the change in consumer surplus. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.